Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Books and Bridges, a humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We explore the wisdoms of the world and apply them to modern life. Whether through literature, philosophy, history, or ethics, we promote sincere dialogue across the human spectrum and value the beauty and depth it brings to our public interactions. Tonight, we delve into the profound world of Russian literature. Our esteemed guest, Gary Saul Morson, is the Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities and Professor of Slavic Languages at Northwestern University. He has been teaching for nearly 50 years. His work focuses on literary theory, the history of ideas, satire, utopia, as well as his favorite writers, Chekhov, Gogol, Dostoyevsky, and Tolstoy. His new book, which is his 21st book, by the way, his new book is from Harvard University Press. It's titled Wonder Confronts Certainty, Russian Writers on the Timeless Questions and Why Their Answers Matter. And I have to say, it's a candy store for lovers of all things Russian. Just show you right here. Let me just tell you a little bit about the book. Dr. Morson brings a lifetime of reflection and wisdom to the discussion. In this book, he weighs the open, curious, probing approach of the artistic masters against the absolutist, unwavering ideological intensity of the revolutionaries. Tolstoy, Dostoyevsky, Turgenev, and Chekhov understood the complexities of human experience in ways that Chernyshevsky, Bakunin, Lenin, and Trotsky did not. Here we see the literature of conscience and vision battle the discourse of theory and coercion. Out of this clash, the universal questions of humankind surface. Questions such as how to know right from wrong, what justifies suffering, where to find meaning, what connects free will with moral responsibility, and why light and darkness wrestle in each human heart. As we navigate the maze of modern life, the Russian masterpieces paint a wide ethical horizon for all of us to ponder. In Morson's telling, Russian literature represents one continuous debate between seeking minds, coursing and stumbling along the myriad tracks of history, traversing the miles of the soul, expanding upon the same edifice of ideas as if they were in the same room. The richness of the Russian personality draws from three types: wanderers who endlessly roam the landscape of meaning, idealists who fixate on one unerring truth, and revolutionists who glory in violence. Each contributes to the mosaic. The enterprise of reading and writing acquires a holy dimension. Russians take literature so seriously that the word must transform them in one way or another. In this quest, there is no lukewarm water to drink. Literature then becomes the Bible of a people. So Dr. Morson, thank you for coming out. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. Did I leave anything out?
No one has ever done such a wonderful summary. I should have you write my ad copy.
Well, that's a great honor. I should get to that. What I will do is just ask you a series of questions. We'll just have a free-flowing discussion. And afterwards, the viewers can ask a few questions themselves. But I wanted to start off our discussion tonight with this idea of dialogue. Now, you open the book and close the book with this idea, this concept of the dialogue of the dead, or you could also call it a world symposium, or what Bakunin calls the dialogic nature of life. Why is dialogue so important in this book, and what role does it play?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Well, there are really two questions there: dialogue and the dialogue of the dead. Let me start with the dialogue of the dead. The dialogue of the dead is a literary genre which I adapted. It comes from antiquity, where there'd be a writer would imagine, okay, now what would happen if, Plato and Virgil and Homer could all meet in the underworld and argue out their differences, right? And, so people could be brought together from different centuries because they're in the underworld. they didn't have to worry about, consequences of what they said, right? They were already dead, right? And this genre has a wonderful lifespan. It was done a lot in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. I don't know, Voltaire would imagine Rabelais and Swift and all the other great ironists, getting together. And it occurred to me that since Russians conceive of the literature, the writers conceive of them as engaged in one conversation. And when a writer, is answering, let's say, another writer from 100 years ago, it's as if the other writer, they were in the room together, right? They're arguing as if it's with the same, time. So it seemed to me that if I imagined the tradition as a big dialogue of the dead like this, it would bring out what was special about it, right? It was one great conversation, which was felt to be, unified. And what's very characteristic of the dialogue of the dead as a form and of Russian literature is that you raise very profound and ultimate questions, but you don't come up with answers. What you come up with is a much deeper understanding of the questions in the issue, right? So you go away having learned a lot, but not having settled anything definitively. And that's, the idea of dialogue by itself, right? Dialogue, which is, the great, I thought it was a great value of the book. It was, as you mentioned, there was a Russian philosopher who thought of it. In a real dialogue, it's not debate. It's not about defeating your opponent. It's about a real exchange where you really listen, and each person winds up learning something, developing their position, saying something that neither could have said at the outset. It's a real exchange. And, that is what, when things are closed and you have all the answers, as in the Soviet Union, doesn't happen, but which is really the way to think about truth and the quest for truth in the world. You must always be open, right, to the conversation continue. If that's what the great writers feel, it's not what the great ideologues feel. They feel they've got the final truth. But the writers, the great writers, Tolstoy, Dostoyevsky, Chekhov, you mentioned Solzhenitsyn, they all think of that truth can be imagined not as a set of definitive statements, not as propositions, but as an exchange, as dialogue that keeps going.
Yeah, one of the things I love about your book, and you mentioned this throughout the book, really, and that is how the purpose of dialogue is not to definitively answer a question necessarily, but to deepen the question itself, to reveal deeper dimensions and layers that the questions themselves really entail.
Yeah, and I think that's true of great literature generally, right? But in Russia, it takes on a particular intensity because the opposite view, that we've got the truth and let's get rid of all this dialogue. We know the answers. Just shut up if you don't believe me. That view, we are certain, was so powerful, and of course took over at one point. But even so, was dominant among, the intelligentsia even before. That it made the writers not just think of the world in terms of open questions and dialogue, but comment on it. They were very aware of it. They weren't just doing it, they were defending it because somebody else was attacking it. And that's part of the Russian tradition. Things that exist elsewhere become much more intense and extreme in Russia, right? English literature tends to be moderate in all things. A passage I love from my favorite English novelist, George Eliot. She has in Middlemarch, a character who has radical views, saying, but the nice thing about being English is that you don't take these views too seriously. You express them, and then you go and have dinner with everybody else the same way everybody else does. It doesn't actually affect the way you live. That's English good sense. That's exactly what Russians don't have. Okay, you take it to the extreme, and it does affect. It affects everything, right? And so people become much more aware of what the well, if you took this to the extreme, what would it lead to? Seems like an academic question in England, but in Russia they do take it to the extreme, and so you can see the implications of the ideas.
What do you think accounts for that aspect of the Russian personality, that tendency to really, what Dostoevsky called to feel an idea?
You know, that's a really, I don't have a good answer to why it arose. You know, it may have been something to do with the fact that Russia westernized overnight under Peter the Great, and absorbed all this Western culture, and so it all seemed as if these ideas were coming into Russia at the same time, and it created this great stir. And which ones are ours? So there was a great feeling of a lot going on, and add to that you know intellectuals in Russia, unlike in England, they really, the educated people for quite a while, till the mid 19th century, had nothing to do. I mean, it was an authoritarian regime, so there was no politics, and until a middle class developed, there wasn't a whole lot. So the sense that they were groundless may have contributed to um, the tendency to take ideas to the extreme. But the answer, I really don't know what produced it. I just know it's there.
So let's get to the title of the actual book. What constitutes the wonder in the book, and what constitutes the certainty and the clash between those two? How does that work out?
Yes, I took the title from a commentator, a scholar who wrote about the Soviet period, and who talked about how a particular writer was always looking for answers, knowing that they weren't there, but was always curious and open, facing a regime which didn't like that. And then this scholar wrote down the sentence as if it were a throwaway. Well, wonder confronts certainty here. And I thought that's the whole point of the whole Russian tradition, right? The writers wonder at the complexity of the world. No matter how much you know about people, you don't exhaust them. There's always more to know about a human being. But the ideologues think they know everything about a human being. They know what people are, what they need, what they listen. If you don't think you know exactly what everybody needs, you can't create the perfect society, because people are different. You don't know what they need. To be a utopian, you have to think you've exhausted the knowledge of human beings and that they're not going to change. You know it forever. But that's just what the great writers don't think. They're always amazed at how complex things are. That things don't look, when you really look closely, they're not the way you expected. Things are much richer, right? And they're trying to get us to appreciate that. That's the wonder.
So tell us what these timeless questions are that Russian literature poses to us. Are they, can they be answered in the affirmative, or are they questions that we must live out in real life?
Well, there are people who think they've answered them, but let me tell you the ones I talk about in the book. The second half of the book is really just the debate on each of the questions. Again, done not historically, not this person said that, but as if there's one big conversation. This is one, and this is the other position, right? As if they were all together. And so one question will be, what is the role of theoretical thought, abstraction, in understanding life? I mean, can you understand life the way physicists understand, physics, but abstract laws? No physicist looks at each particular particle and says how wonderfully different from some other particle, right? Can you do that with people, or is theory ultimately limited, and you have to stress the particularities of things? So that would be one question. And of course, Marxist Leninism thinks no, it is the theory of theories, right? And another question will be, well, if we live in a purely materialistic world, there's nothing transcendent, no God, no spirit, just the laws of nature, as of course the materialists and the atheists and the revolutionaries insisted, where do right and wrong come from? Well, can there be any, you could say, well, social convention, but then they're not really about right and wrong. They're no different from parking regulations, right? Yeah, you have a rule, but there's no reason it has to be that way, and there's no moral opprobrium for breaking it. Well, and what's more, if the materialism is deterministic, then how do you hold people responsible for what they do? Maybe you can. Many people thought you couldn't. That people did what the laws of nature made them to do, right? But then it's very hard to get good and evil out of that either. If I, let's say, were to drop a coin, right, it would fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, as it hit the ground. As that, people who've had first year physics will know, right? And if you ask, well, is that moral or immoral? It's a ridiculous question. But if we are nothing but very complex coins governed by the laws of nature as much as it is, then the question is just as ridiculous as well. But it's very hard to live with that. It's very hard to live. I don't know anybody who actually lives a life where they think they have no free will, and where, I know people who think that, well, there really is no such thing as right and wrong except empty social convention, but they still feel guilt and regret, right? And how do you feel regret if the universe is deterministic? Regret means you could have done something else and didn't, but you couldn't have done something else if you're a determinist, right? But yet people still feel it. So anyway, these are another argument that takes place. That's closely related to one about, the nature of time. Is time open? Does it branch with many possibilities of which one takes place, but many could have? And how do you think about the world if you think that there are more possibilities than actualities? How do you look at your own life? How do you look at the past? How do you understand people if you could have been something else, who are you? So that'll be another one. Yet another one is, what excuses do people use for not taking moral responsibility when they should? The philosopher Bakunin calls this trying to have an alibi. Well, an example might be, you can imagine some communist interrogator, torturing his prisoners, and he says, yeah, but I'm not responsible for this. I'm just the representative of the party, right? That would be a way of finding a moral alibi. I didn't do it. I was just, I'm just the representative, right? I just had to do it. We try in many ways. Well, if fate made me do it, society made me do it. These are all alibis, right? And the point of this philosopher is that there are no alibis. We are responsible for what we do at every moment. But some people don't think that. That would be another kind of question that comes up. And finally, the last one I talk about is, well, does life have a meaning or not? And if so, what is it? A lot of us would say, well, it's individual happiness. But if you really think about it, that's kind of shallow, don't you think? I mean, the whole world exists so I can have ice cream? I mean, come on. What sort of, the universe exists so I can be, maximize pleasure and minimize pain? I mean, in that case, you might as well be a brain in a vat with electrodes connected to it, to your pleasure center. Russians do not think that the purpose of life is happiness. And Chekhov has some wonderful stories about this, including one called Happiness, right? But then some will go to the other extreme and says, well, if you're happy, that means you can't be living right, which doesn't seem quite right to me either. But maybe suffering can be good because it makes you a better person. You think about things you wouldn't have thought otherwise. Or maybe suffering can be bad because it distorts your personality. So how do all these things figure in what's a meaningful life? That's, that's the last question I talk about. ultimately the most important one, right? Because all these questions we all face, but that one, well, we're always all facing it, right?
Well, thanks. The anecdote that I always go back to that helps me kind of understand the appeal, the kind of the deep appeal that Russian literature has is, this is probably a decade ago. There was a prison program that decided to bring in, teachers of Russian literature. Instead of like bringing in preachers or Bible teachers, they brought in teachers of Russian literature to talk about the heavy works, mainly from Dostoyevsky and Tolstoy, probably. But those books had such an effect on the prisoners that they reported that they were moved and changed by those books more than anything else.
I think you're one of the people who did that, and you have wonder, and it's been imitated. And you get with prisoners wonderful reaction if they read Crime and Punishment. They understand crime, right? And that's what this book is about. What motivates it? What's the responsibility there? You get wonderful discussions out of that, I'm told.
Yeah, well, there's something about the saying, the Russian soul. And I want to read something that Virginia Woolf wrote, and you describe it in your book very well. But she was just really moved by Russian literature. She said, "It is the soul itself that is the chief character in Russian fiction." Quoting Solzhenitsyn, "The greatness of a people is to be sought in its breadth of soul." And finally, Dostoevsky says, "The soul is the person in the person." So what is this force of soul in Russian literature? What are your ideas?
Yeah, well, the Dostoevsky quote is, my novels are about the person within the person. That is the depth of the human being. What makes you who you are. That's ultimately, we don't know who we are, right? We're always deceiving ourselves, right? We don't really know who we are. You have to quest for it. It's not obvious, right? And could there be a more important question that you ask? How can you be true to yourself if you don't know who you are? You could be true to some role that you're playing, but that may not be you, right? And, those are questions that, for example, in Tolstoy's wonderful novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, is all about, he comes to be dying and he realizes that everything he has done has been fulfilling, one social role or another that he was expecting. He does it very well, so he's had a good life in that sense. But he realizes that there's never been any self in anything. It's as if he hadn't lived at all. There's nothing there. And he has this horrible realization that he has lived wrongly for that reason. But it's only because he's suffering from a long lingering illness that he thinks this, right? And it's a story. Some people think of The Death of Ivan Ilyich as the greatest short novella in world literature. And it's very hard to read it without examining your own life. It's as if Tolstoy is, you're not going to be just a reader here. I'm going to take you by the throat and make you think about how you live. And there are a few Russian writers who have that effect, but Tolstoy, in particular. So that's what, when Virginia Woolf was talking about the soul is the hero, right? That's the sort of thing she means. Another writer at the time said, reading Dostoevsky feels like going into a dark room and being assaulted. And he meant the same thing. You can't just read it. It forces you to think about your life.
Your book is chock full of examples of how characters deal with their own self-deception, how they deceive themselves, how they kind of peek in on themselves, deceiving themselves. And the example I think of is Chekhov's short story called Lights. It seemed to have a big impact on you. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, yeah. Well, first I'll say, self-deception is a theme in all realist fiction. The great English novel, George Eliot is about it. Trollope is about it. I mean, what we are always deceived by our pride and prejudice. That's probably what Jane Austen called it that way. So all these novels are about that. But they don't generally theorize about it. They show people who are self-deceptive. The Russians both show it better than anybody else, but they also talk about it. So you get well, self-deception is not an obvious. Philosophers had a lot of trouble with it because, listen, if you know something, you can't. How do you lie to yourself and say something else because you know it's false? You can lie to somebody else and they don't know. How do you lie to yourself if you're simultaneously, right? Well, it's not a philosophers have trouble with this, but in fact, we do it all the time. And if you want to know how, you go to, let's say, a book like Anna Karenina, and Tolstoy shows you step by step, how people do it, right? And you get a much deeper sense of the self, if you think of it that way. I'm sorry, when you also were asking something other than self-deception.
Chekhov's short story called Lights.
Lights, right. Well, Lights is a wonderful story. It begins with, a conversation between an older engineer and a young engineer. And the young engineer thinks he's very clever by saying, well, nothing in the world has any meaning. It's just, whatever we want to make of it, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, so I might as well just seek my own pleasure, and nothing matters because we're all going to die soon anyway, right? He thinks this is incredibly clever. You believe in something, I'm sophisticated enough to believe in nothing, right? Remember, when I first started teaching, I've found this a very common attitude in academia. It's what fueled the love of deconstruction. You think you know something. We know there's nothing there, right? And it's taken on many forms since then. It's eternally appealing to a certain sort of mind, right? Because it makes them cleverer than anybody else. Well, the older engineer says, I used to believe that, and it led me to do some bad things I am now ashamed of, which I should never have done. Right? And he tells that story. Then he comes up and he says, at the end, you see, it's one thing to believe in, Ecclesiastes as the result of a long life of thinking for an older person. It's quite another to start out with that view, the way you are doing. And the young man says, as a philosopher might, if it's the same view, who cares who, But no, the way you arrive at an idea becomes part of it for real people. Not in philosophical argument, but in the way it affects you, right, is determined in large part by how you've gotten there. And it will mean something very different. So that's how the story examines. There are a whole lot of Ecclesiastes stories, and that Chekhov wrote. He was fascinated with it. People thinking about life as meaningless, and then perhaps, coming to find meaning, and contrasting those two states of the soul. So the Lights is really a beautiful story. Another one is, that he has, it's very short, 3 pages long, called The Student, which starts about, it's this divinity student who's coming home on Easter, Good Friday, right? And the world around, the weather is terrible. It's cold. Everything about is barren and poor, as it is in a lot of Russia. And he thinks, it was like this 1,000 years ago, barren and poor, and it will be like this 1,000 years from now. Everything is the same, and nothing has any meaning whatsoever. And he's horribly depressed. And then he winds up, he sees these 2 women whom he knows, but not well, in front of a fire there, and he goes to talk to them. And being in front of a fire reminds him of the time, well, it's Easter, that Peter denied Jesus 3 times, right? And he tells the story from within. And these women are deeply moved. Presumably, they have betrayed, each one has betrayed somebody or been betrayed. Chekhov doesn't specify, but just specifies how deeply they are moved by it, right? And when the young man leaves, he thinks, it wasn't because of the way I told the story. It's because the story itself is eternal and touches on eternal things. And there's a link, a great human chain of meaning from 2,000 years ago, and these events happened to now. And I am part of that chain. And so he switched from a world of utter meaninglessness to one of real meaning. But unless you think that Chekhov is preaching that, he ends the story by saying, well, you know, he was very happy. Well, of course, he was only 23 or something like this, right? So he casts a little irony off the end, lest you be too sure of yourself, right? Yeah, it's a beautiful story. Chekhov thought it was his favorite, you know.
It really does matter what the reader brings to the experience of engaging a text. The reader has a responsibility to kind of to be a filter through which the writer can connect with the reader, and I think that's going on in all of Russian literature as well, and in all of literature really.
But in Russia takes a special, you know, particularly in the Soviet period when a lot of the books you read, it's criminal to have. And so, you know, reading really does, you take a risk to read, right? And, you know, a lot of these books that couldn't be published, the way they circulated was what's called self-publishing. People would get a copy and stay up all night retyping it on, you know, carbon paper. And, you know, then they would pass it on. And oh, that's how these books got, you know, got circulated. But if you got caught, well, that was a bad. So, you know, reading was not just sitting back and enjoying it. It was a real commitment, right? As reading should be, although you shouldn't be arrested for it, but, you know, it should feel like moral. At least that's what the Russian writers are thinking, right? They're not interested, for the most part, in just entertainment. Their books are entertaining, but that's not the point, right? Right. The point is, you must change your life, right? That's a poem by Rilke says that, right? That's what Russian literature is saying.
No, I like Rilke.
Well, he was influenced heavily by Tolstoy, you know, so perhaps it comes from there.
I don't know. So let's talk about, you know, we've mentioned already this tendency of Russian readers to really take seriously a text as almost a holy undertaking, and you know that can have a positive effect or a negative effect. And so one thing your book just really points out well is it describes the how would you put this, the antecedents or the ground, the soil on which terrorism grew out of Russia. We don't, when you think of terrorism, we don't really think of it as having Russian roots. How did terrorism and populism originate in Russia, and why did it travel to other countries?
Yeah, I mean, there had been something you could call terrorism beforehand, but it was in Russia that it first really became important and institutionalized, right? Look, by the turn of the 20th century, there were hundreds and hundreds of terrorists. It was a recognized profession that ran in families, right? I mean, your uncle Andre was a terrorist. You're just going to be an art student? There's a character in Solzhenitsyn who says that. Why don't you do something serious with your life? Be a terrorist, you know, your aunt will say. This really was true, right? It was, you know, it was regarded as a prestigious, if rather dangerous, profession, right? And, you know, you know, listen, there were years in the early 20th century when, you know, hundreds and thousands of people were throwing bombs, or they throw sulfuric acid in a postman's face because he was a government official and so on, right? Or they throw bombs into cafes laced, you know, laced with nails. And there were a few years when it was so common that there were more terrorist actions than traffic accidents. I mean, one wonderful story I love is about, you know, a new head of the police is appointed for this small town, or maybe it's a governor, I can't remember which. And one of the reporters says to the editor of the local paper, well, shall we run his biography? And the editor says, no, save it for the obituary. Right? He's going to be assassinated before long, right? It was, well, a lot of these terrorists they weren't, uneducated. They were the highly literate people, many of them, right? Some of them were uneducated, but some of them were highly literate. And they wrote memoirs, right? Which are fascinating. There was, a long memoir by the terrorist Vera Figner, which is partly translated, which is really wonderful about her, giving her worldview. And then there was, a lot of them were women, by the way, which is another unique Russian. About a third of them were women, right? And women very often, when the day that the terrorists finally managed to kill Tsar Alexander II, they were led by a woman. Okay, at that point. And it's, well, my favorite of all terrorists, who I think I talk about in the book, was a guy named Boris Savinkov, who loved terror not because he wanted to establish some utopian regime. He just loved terror. He loved the risk. He loved the danger. And he did it for a party called the Socialist Revolutionaries, which was a non-Marxist socialist party. But he would have done, at time he was perfectly, he would do it for anybody, as long as it was terror, right? And he killed a lot of important people, but he started out, well, in his early years, he started keeping clippings from the newspaper, reviews of his novels, and reviews of his terrorist activity, right? Because he was a novelist as well as a terrorist, right? He wrote novels about terrorism, right? And one of them has been translated. They're not bad. I mean, they're not great, but they're not bad. And I was never able, reading his novels and reading his memoirs and reading about him, I couldn't decide whether he wrote novels to celebrate his activity as a terrorist, or he became a terrorist to have material for his novels. Since he kept clippings of both from the beginning, it's really kind of hard to say. But one of the things that's clear is that he was engaged in the two most prestigious occupations in Russia at the time, writer and terrorist, right?
Well, you write in the book about that, and I'll just quote from the book: literature exists to represent life, we naturally think, but Russians often speak as if life existed to provide material for literature.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Can literature be more real than life?
More important is the point. I mean, the way Russians think about literature, the way they say the phrase Russian literature, is not the way Americans say American literature, English literature, French literature. They say it as if it's a sacred phrase. And, it's the only thing I can compare with. It's so important. It's so important. The only thing I can compare it with is how the ancient Hebrews must have viewed the Bible when you could still add books to the canon, when the canon was still open, right? That's what literature is. I remember the poet, Soviet poet Osip Mandelstam, who was shot by Stalin, telling his wife Nadezhda, wrote these wonderful memoirs, and her pictures on the cover of that book, by the way. She quotes him saying, "I am at rest about poetry in Russia. Only in Russia is it taken so seriously that people are shot for it." Okay. Or another one of the stories I really love, it shows how important it is one of the novelists is having trouble getting one of his novels published. Somebody's afraid to publish it. It may not be orthodox. So he writes to Stalin asking for permission to publish it. And what actually happened, a few weeks later, he gets summoned to the Kremlin. And there he's led into a room where there is Stalin and the person running the army and the person running the economy and the editor of the leading newspaper. And the others are all there just to witness what he's going to say about this novel, right? And Stalin has read the novel and read it carefully and offers various critiques, right? And finally he says, you can publish it, but you have to change the name. This is going to be the new name, right? Now, can you imagine Joe Biden, George Bush, Barack Obama spending his time reading a damn novel? I mean, but in Russia, it's so important, right? I mean,
Wasn't Stalin a deep reader of not only, maybe theory, but also just fiction?
Yeah, no, I mean, we think of Stalin as a thug. That's true of Lenin, who really, strangely enough, didn't know Russian literature. He knew just a few radical pamphlets, didn't know the whole tradition. Stalin had a library of 20,000 books, all of which he selected himself, and even invented a cataloging system for it, and hired, of course, being Stalin, hired his own librarian to take care of it, right? And it didn't make him more humane, but it certainly meant he was not illiterate, right?
Let me ask a couple more questions, and then we'll open up to the viewers. This question deals with the heavy role of a writer in Russia. Can a great writer be both a second government, as Solzhenitsyn has said, and a prophet, as Dostoyevsky has said? Is that secular and sacred mantle? Is that too heavy for literature to bear?
Well, I think what Solzhenitsyn means by a sacred government is
Second.
a second government. Sorry,
Yeah.
Second government. It's sort of like, I guess you could compare it, in the Middle Ages, where you had the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, right? One was in charge of secular affairs, the other of moral affairs. Let's set aside the fact that the Pope also wanted to do secular affairs, but for the moment, moral affairs, right? Well, that's the writer, whether you call him a prophet or, a second government. What it meant is the moral authority of the world. You've got the political authority, the physical power. We as a writer have the moral authority, right? That's Tolstoy. The writer can challenge political power. Well, think of this, the importance of Solzhenitsyn, right? And strangely, Solzhenitsyn also had so much influence abroad. It was the publication of his account of the Gulag Archipelago, that finally made Marxism not popular among the intelligentsia in France. It didn't have that effect elsewhere, but it did have it in France, right? We finally, could see, what that was. And, rulers took that very seriously, right? And it's still the case that literature is, very important in Russia in a way that I don't think it has ever been anywhere else. Except if you think of, sacred writings, and you're thinking of, the ancient Hebrews or the early Christians. There it might be, but that's what you have to compare it with.
Yeah. And say a few words about the prophetic nature of some Russian writing.
Well, the one who's most frequently thought of as prophetic is Dostoyevsky. And the reason for that is that, everybody else, so as far as I can tell, there's no exceptions, in the 19th century. Imagine the 20th century as better, much better than the 19th. It would be an era of greater liberalism and humanity, and people would be gentler, and societies would be more humane and progressive in all those ways. And Dostoevsky said no. That may be true some places, but in many places it's going to be worse than has ever been before. And he described in detail what we now call totalitarianism. I mean, things he described, if they didn't happen in the Soviet Union, they happened in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, right? I mean, extraordinary. He was the only person in the 19th century who saw it coming, right? And, so he feels like a prophet, right? How did he know? You can ask. What's the question I've asked myself? How did he know? And, it wasn't, he didn't have any revelations from beyond. I mean, it was, he really deeply understood the radical intelligentsia and how they thought, because he was an ex-revolutionary himself, right? So he knew it, right? And he asked himself, well, if these people ever gained power, what would they do? And he's being a great writer, he could imagine, right? And he didn't say, oh, well, you're just exaggerating. No, he took it very serious, and he was right.
Didn't Chekhov say something kind of similar, with less strong language, but something somewhat similar?
Yeah, he was, quite upset at the, intolerance, for different views of the, of the intelligentsia. They were saying, you need to stop this question stuff. You need to provide answers. And of course, he wasn't going to do that, right? And you have to break off your friendship with this guy because he associates with conservatives. You can't associate with him, and that kind of thing, right? And Chekhov, at one point said, if these toads and crocodiles ever gain the power they seek, it'll be worse than the Inquisition in Spain. Now, of course, that turned out to be a gross understatement. The Inquisition doesn't remotely compare in horror to the best periods of the Soviet Union, right? But at the time, Inquisition seemed like the worst thing you could say, right?
Yeah. Well, so the last question I want to ask you is, what are some of your favorite works of Russian literature? Is that allowed for an objective, learned professor like you to say?
Well, of course, I love, the works you've been talking about, the Dostoyevsky's great novels and Anna Karenina and War and Peace, which I teach all the time, and Chekhov's wonderful stories. I guess those would be the great. But if you want me to say something less obvious than that, I really recommend, if people haven't read it already, a 20th century novel by Mikhail Bulgakov called The Master and Margarita. Make sure you read it in the Bergen O'Connor translation. It's a comic masterpiece and deeply philosophical as well as hilarious. The premise of it is that the devil and his retinue come to Stalinist Russia, where everybody's an atheist, and you get they play very funny practical jokes on people, right? And meanwhile, you get, there's a novelist who's writing a novel about what really happened when Jesus met Pontius Pilate. And so you get extracts from this novel too. And so it becomes really philosophically profound about the ultimate questions of, faith and belief in life, while at the time being in passages so funny, you laugh out loud. So that's one book I really recommend. I think you'll be very moved by this novel by Vasily Grossman called Life and Fate. It's set in World War II and begins, in a Nazi concentration camp, and then goes, to discuss the Soviet, situation. And again, in all these places, it's raising the ultimate questions of good and evil and morality in a way which is really interesting and, and profound. So those would be two, less obvious books that I would.
Yeah, thanks. I was also impressed with Nadezhda Mandelstam's Hope Against Hope, by the way you describe it in the book.
Those are her memoirs, and they're just, memoirs are an important genre in Russian literature. There are a lot of really great literary works. This is one of them, right? And it's a masterpiece of prose. It's a masterpiece of analysis, and well, it's called Hope Against Hope. She understood the English idiom, although she wrote it in Russian. the name Nadezhda means hope in Russian, so she was aware, of the pun there. But it's reflections on, for example, about, well, why did so many people, try to believe in communism when they knew better? Which is an eternal question you can ask. I know a lot of people who profess belief in what I think are really immoral and terrible things, but they try to get themselves to believe it, and they think they're doing the right thing by doing it. And they think of their reluctance as, oh, just old-fashioned humanism, which is holding me back from seeing, the higher truth. And that's what was happening there too, and she talks about the psychology in a way which is really quite profound. And so you'll understand a lot more than just about what was going on in Russia.
Yeah, I definitely intend to reread that. And her husband, Osip Mandelstam,
Who was a
who
wonderful
was,
poet.
who was, of course, he was killed in the Gulag, right?
Right.
Yeah.
By the way, the writer, another great writer of short stories, Vadim Shalov, Shallamov, a brilliant short story writer. His stories are all set in the Gulag, where he barely survived himself. He came in as a big man weighing 200 pounds, and before long he was weighed under 90 pounds, right? Barely survived. But he did, and he wrote wonderful stories about it. And one of them is he imagines the death of Osip Mandelstam.
The death of whom?
Osip Mandelstam, the poet.
Oh.
He imagines it in one of the stories, what it must have been, what Mandelstam would have been thinking, right, as the poet dies in these situations. It's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful story.
Well, thanks. Let me just go to one comment from a viewer. Randall Paul. He says, "No questions this time, just a comment. This has been the most interesting and enlightening session you have ever had on Books and Bridges to me, even including my own masterful presentation he presented it. I will read the book, but this writer's personal presentation is so lucid, learned, and original that I am grateful you allowed him this interview."
This is
Randall Paul.
Okay.
A friend of Books and Bridges. He presented on his own book about religious dialogue, interreligious dialogue. So yeah, thanks, Randy. I think he had to leave though. So please feel free to ask any questions that you have, viewers out there. I appreciate that you mentioned War and Peace. I think if I was to name my favorite, it would be War and Peace, just because it's so grand in scope. It seems to really touch on really almost the full scope of questions that human beings experience and agonize over in life.
I tell you, there are moments in that book where you see how he described how the human mind works in a way that you think he must be superhuman to understand this. It's just extraordinary. Dostoyevsky, thinking about this, said that nobody who ever lived had more literary talent than Count Tolstoy. And I know quite a number of people who think that he, not Shakespeare, is the world's greatest writer. It's a tough choice.
So Betsy Vandenberg, who is also a longtime friend of Books and Bridges, she's a writer herself. She says, "Dr. Morson, your description of characters and self-deception reminds me of something you wrote brilliantly about in First Things magazine. You describe Raskolnikov's delusion that his ideas are his own, that he's some sort of original genius, when really he is just imbibing the ideas circulating in the cafes and student enclaves he frequents. How can we recognize this phenomenon in our own lives and determine which ideas are moral and which are dangerous and evil?"
You've asked exactly the right question. I mean, it's Solzhenitsyn, for example, describes how I'll tell you the story and you'll see. He describes how he's believes in all things at this point that the Soviet regime has taught him, and they hear that President Roosevelt has made a public prayer, and of course he said, "Oh, it's entirely cynical," and this other guy comes and said, why are you so sure that he couldn't be a believer? Why are you so sure that he couldn't actually believe in God? And Solzhenitsyn looks at him and says, why, do you believe in God? And says, yes, of course. The man is Jewish, by the way, right? Yes, of course, he says. And then Solzhenitsyn, I had all the answers ready, but all of a sudden, I realized that those answers, what I would have said, were things that had been planted in me from an early age, and that I had not arrived at them myself. And I did not know what I really thought. And this he describes as the beginning of what eventually would lead him to faith. Right? But the first is to recognize, if you find yourself always agreeing with some group, and when it changes views, your views change just the same way, right? Over many, many years, you can be pretty sure that, you've adopted these views ready-made. They aren't you. Or you would find yourself questioning sometimes, right? And when you realize this, then you start asking, well, so am I looking for evidence to support what I want to believe? Or am I interested in the truth? And that's very hard, because people naturally look for evidence for what they want to believe, right? I don't know a whole lot of people who read magazines from different parts of the political spectrum, right? I mean, I make a habit, of doing so, which is why my mailbox is filled with, I'm done for money from every conceivable political, because they all think, because they're all assuming, well, if you read this magazine, you must completely agree with it. But I read it, because I want to understand how different people think, right? And that's the only way to ever get to your truth, not to just the uniform. Dostoyevsky calls it putting on the uniform.
Yeah. And I think that's the wonder of dialogue, is that we may start with questions or answers that we think that we've originated, but the more that we engage in dialogue, the more that we search our own selves, the more we come to our own originality.
Yeah.
It reminds me of what Cormac McCarthy said about his own writing process. He said, the sad truth is books are made of books, and that writers tend to, draw upon other books, and you can't, the desire to be so original that you come up with something that no one else has come up with. Even the great ones don't necessarily always do that. But if you're sincere in your desire to be in dialogue, you don't have to worry about influence or impact.
Yeah, there's a passage in Anna Karenina where Tolstoy describes an artist who's a true artist, and he doesn't care what school his painting falls into. He completely ignores that. He just is trains himself to see and see in his own way, and just conveys his vision without caring, for any of the debates of the schools or all that, right? That's sort of Tolstoy's own image, and I try to tell my students that that's an ideal to strive for, in life. If you really want to, not die like Ivan Ilyich, when you realize you haven't engaged in anything, just your roles, then you have to be willing to question yourself and ask uncomfortable questions, which, may make other people not like you, because you're suddenly differing from them. But if you make sure never to differ from them, then who are you?
Yeah, that's the question we all need to ask. Perhaps this will be the last question. Do you have faith in the upcoming generation of Russian writers?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know how to answer that. There are some good writing right now, but no one of the stature of the great classics. There's one I like. He has one wonderful book, a man named Eugene Vodolazkin, and his book is called Laurus. The author
Yeah.
was a specialist in the Middle Ages, and this is a book imagining the world from the perspective of a medieval. So it's narrated from that perspective, and he eventually becomes saintly. And it's really quite beautifully done. That's a really good book. But on the whole, you've got things that are reasonably good and reasonably clever, but I don't know of anything, in the last 20 years, let's say, except maybe Loris, which is really, which will be read 100 years from now. Still, within Russia, the importance of literature is so great that I'm quite confident there will be some great Russian writers to come.
Let me just end by reading a paragraph from your book, which I think sums things up really nicely. You write, the greatest literature advances understanding not by supplying final answers to eternally open questions, but by revealing new depths in the questions themselves. Wisdom begins with better questions posed more thoughtfully, and literature, if it accomplishes what it should, leaves its readers wiser. Thank you very much, Dr. Morson, for coming, and I urge you all to go out and buy this book. Not only is it just a treasure trove of insights on Russian literature, but I believe it's much more than that. It's a lens on how to look at the world, how to look at what literature means. What is propaganda? What does it mean to deceive yourself? What does it mean to find out who you are? And so I urge you all to go out and buy it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Would love to have you again sometime.
I'd love to come, and I'd love to hear more of those questions too.
Oh, for sure. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we will see you next time. Bye.